Okay, this is the second part of my presentation, and as I said before, we talked about the legends, the myths of language learning, and now we're going to talk about methods and cognitive principles, or just principles of learning. Now, the very first question is, can we learn how kids learn languages? A common suggestion is that we should learn like kids do. And that is called the natural way. Now, it's a fact that, without a doubt, kids end up learning a language very well. But the wrong conclusion that people draw, or some people draw, is that if you learn like a kid or try to learn like a kid, you will succeed. Now, let me start by saying that, in general, the conditions in which kids and adults learn languages are quite different. First of all, kids don't have another language. They have just one language. They don't have another language like adults influencing the language you're learning. And as I said before, they have no choice but to learn because they live the language. So the main difference is that learning your first language is the result of living. It's not the result of a choice you make to learn another language. And normally when you have no choice, you cannot make a bad choice. But adults can actually make the wrong choice, and they can learn the wrong way, and they can give up. But this doesn't necessarily mean that kids learn better and faster. Now, in English, there's an expression, when you say that you're comparing apples with oranges, it means that you're comparing things that have nothing to do with one another. And that's the case of language learning for adults and for kids. Now, I believe that a fair comparison should be done in the same conditions. Now, it's true that adults have some disadvantages, but we don't have enormous disadvantages. So let's look at the way kids learn a language first, and in what conditions. Now, first of all, as Richard said before, they have a family. And this means that kids are surrounded by the language since they are born. This implies affection from your mother, from your father, but also playing time and natural and genuine curiosity towards the world. And this psychological factor plays a huge role in language learning. And then we all go to school. And in school, we learn a second language in a formal context. We interact with our classmates. We get corrected by our teacher when we speak and when we write. So, learning a language is also the result of a social interaction with your peers, with your classmates, and with other learners. And then we all like watching movies, listening to the radio, listening to music. And we spend a lot of time, without even thinking about it, we spend a lot of time listening to the language. And then, of course, we have a lot of friends. All this helps us learn a language as kids. Now, if we do the math, a year normally is like 365 days. Let's suppose that we're considering a teen-year-old kid. So times 18 years, and then 24 hours, because the brain learns even when we're sleeping. And this is almost 80,000 hours of reading, listening, speaking, and living the language. Everything happens as a whole process in the course of a long time. Now, let's consider the conditions in which adults learn languages. First of all, we have interference from our native language. And this implies interference in grammar, syntax, pronunciation, and so on. And then kids are more genuinely curious than us. We are still curious, but a little differently than them. As I said before, adults have problems, psychological problems, when they have to speak, when they fear making mistakes, they fear being judged by others. And there are other factors, like we have less time, we don't have an environment surrounding us and where the language is constantly spoken. We have other commitments in life, we have a job, we have to do a lot of things in our life, and we're generally busy. So this basically means that comparing is difficult because conditions are different. First of all, because, as I said before, there are some internal psychological factors, like the one I talked about before. Having no language means that you can learn any other language and you have no interference. And then there's this emotional connection with the world in which the language is spoken that plays a huge role. And then, apart from the psychological internal factors, there are also the external environmental factors. Now, if any of you, go living in, say, Italy for 18 years, and then you hear, you listen, you speak, you go to school, you get corrected. If you follow exactly the same pattern, the path that kids followed, I am sure that you will speak the language quite well. And you will reach, maybe you will not reach a native level, but you will reach a very high level that will allow you to do whatever you want to do in that language. Now, how do we learn a second language? Well, first of all, most of us don't go living in another country. We stay in our own country. So how can we learn a language as independent learners in the comfort of our home? Now, as I said before, the bad news is that we don't have all the advantages that kids have, but there's also good news, because we have some advantages as adults. Now, when we start doing something, whatever it is, I think it's very important to start with the right mindset. And obviously, you have to make the right choices. Now, on the internet, there's a lot of people asking themselves, what is the best method to learn a language? Now, the problem is that searching for a universal, objective, efficient method is pointless. Let me explain you why. Now, the reason why there is no one best method is because each and every one of you have a different learning style and different tastes. What is good for me might not good for you. It's a trial and error process. It means that you have to try and you have to see what suits you best since the very beginning. So an important principle is to figure out what you like since the very beginning. Now, before delving in talking about methods, let me talk about basic cognitive principles. The very first thing, the very important thing is attitude. Having a positive mindset is very important, and you have to know since the very beginning that learning languages is fun and it's not as difficult as people think. So the attitude that you have, not only towards the language but also towards the people, plays a very, very important role in language learning. Now, the psychological factor is, as I said before, absolutely essential. You have to know your limits. We're all human beings. We all make mistakes. So if we know that we have limits, it can be our force. Make the time. Now, one of the most common excuses for language learners is that they say, I don't have the time to learn a language. Quintilian, who was a Roman rhetorician, said, it is not that we don't have time, it is that we make poor use of it. And he was right, I think, because we always find time to do things that we like. So the next question would be, how do we make the time? As you can see, that small thing there which is a portable device, as you know, a real revolution for language learning, because you can use it anywhere and whenever you want it. Obviously, you have to want it. You can do it while walking, driving the car, washing the dishes, and even when you go to the supermarket. Now, another very important principle is consistency. That means that in order to be successful, you have to learn every single day, and possibly even twice a day. For example, spending 30 minutes deliberately studying, for example, listening and reading something when you feel fresh, and weekends, for example, when you don't work. And if you're a little bit tired or you're doing something else, you can use your dead time by listening to portable devices. And I showed you the example before, like when you go to the supermarket, when you're at home cleaning up or washing the dishes, etc. The big advantage of this, of studying every single day, is that you are feeding the brain. You're giving it food. And another important thing is that the brain normally learns with small chunks of information. So people might think that if they spend 10 hours learning a language every day, it's actually better than spending 30 minutes. But when you spend too much time doing something, your level of concentration goes down. You have the impression that you're learning a lot, but you're not learning efficiently. And you don't burn out. Burn out means that you are tired, sick and tired of the language, and you don't want to learn it anymore, which is a very common mistake that people make. Now, another principle is the fact that the input, that is what you read and what you listen to, has to be intelligible. You have to understand it. And as I said before, it has to be interesting. Another very important thing is that you have to vary your work, because if you always do the same thing, then it gets boring. For example, when you have a text in front of your eyes and you keep reading and reading, or just your activity, your language learning activity is reading, then it gets boring. So if you consider a text, so a piece of information, and you have audio as well, you can not only read it, if you think about it, you can also read and listen at the same time. You can just listen to it, or you can even read it out loud, or speak to yourself by using the things that you have seen in the text. So what counts is not only how much you do things, but also how you do things. The advantages are that listening and reading at the same time is an easy thing to do. Everybody can do it. And when you change and vary your operations and your activities, it keeps you interested and motivated. Like in all schools in the world, language is one of the subjects that you have to study, a foreign language. And unfortunately, sometimes it's considered, most of the times I would say, it's considered like another subject to study. But as I said before, languages have to be learned. They don't have to be studied. You cannot study a language, you can only learn it. A very important thing is rote memorization. That means when you learn things by heart. So you think that learning by heart is a good thing, like when they tell you you can learn, for example, a poetry by heart. But speaking a language is actually the ability of assembling blocks, assembling bricks in order to produce something. You learn by repeating things, varying things, and getting exposed to content, obviously. So the bottom line of this is that you don't learn grammar, and you learn grammar and words from context. If you think about it, that's exactly what kids do. You learn by repeating, by revising things, not by learning things by heart. Another very important thing is motivation. If you have a beautiful Ferrari, but you don't have any fuel in it, it's like having no Ferrari at all. So most people give up after some time because they don't know how to keep themselves interested, to keep themselves motivated. An easy thing to do this, to motivate yourself, is to think about what you can do with only some months of studying. You can travel all around the world, and it makes speaking languages makes your life easier. You can talk to people. You can read interesting books about the culture of that country or that language. You can watch interesting documentaries or movies and television. And for the most romantic of you, you can even find love. And obviously, friendship, which is an important thing in life. So every time you start learning in your learning session, think about all the amazing things that you can do in your life. This means that actually languages can change your life, and they changed mine. Another principle is action. Learning speaking languages, interacting with human beings, is actually the art of imperfection. Each and every one of you have tried to babble in a language and trying to say something, and at the beginning it was difficult. Each and every one of you made mistakes when trying to come across your ideas. And kids make a lot of mistakes before they learn to speak a language well. So you have to accept your limits and to know that in order to do something well, you first have to do it poorly. In my experience, I find a lot of so-called perfectionists. That is, people who want to speak the language perfectly since the very beginning. And I think that perfectionism is actually not a good thing when it comes to language learning. So when it comes to talking to people, speaking to people, you have to feel ready. Yeah. And when you feel ready, you can start, for example, talking to yourself. Some people might think that you have become completely crazy if they see you speaking to yourself on the street. But actually, I found out that a lot of people do it, for example, when taking a shower. And speaking to yourself is not a far-fetched, it's not a crazy idea, it's actually a very effective one. And of course, as I said before, you can always find a partner online or in life with whom you can interact. For example, you can exchange a language for another. So the bottom line of this is that language is a communication tool. It is something we use to talk to other people. And we perfect it by using it. And when we do, it becomes an automatic process. You don't think when you speak Russian, you just speak it. And this is not only for your native tongue, but also for other languages that you want to learn. So there is no best language path that you can follow, but there's your language path. It means that when we have, for example, to go from point A to point B, there are all sorts of possible ways to reach that point. Proof of that is that, evidence of that is the fact that, for example, I or Richard, we have learned languages in very different ways. Yet, I think we both learn it well. So another thing is that you have to try to find your own language path. Now, this is my personal language path, so it's not universal, but that's what I normally do with languages. Here on the axis, you can see T, which stands for time, and this is the efficiency with which you learn, and it depends on time. So at the beginning, that this is so-called the beginner phase. What happens is that you start learning a language slowly. That's the way I do it. It means that I decide to learn slowly because the language is unknown. But then when you have a feeling of the language, it becomes a little bit more familiar. Something amazing happens in your brain, which people call the epiphany point, where you develop a feel for the language. It's in your head, you can use it. And when that happens, you can learn faster without even realizing it by using the language. That means that the language is automatic. It's an automatic cognitive process. So if we consider every single stage, at the beginning the language is totally unknown. And the advice that I give you, as I said before, is to work a little bit every single day. The content that you can start with when you learn a language can be, for example, language series, like books that help you learn a language at the beginning. My personal method is to use, for example, bilingual texts. If I want to learn Russian, for example, I would make sure that I always have a text in Italian or some other language that helps me understand the text in Russian. And then I use a special technique, which is called bilingual translation, that helps me extract the information and keep it in my head. And the principle here is that it's better to put quality in your work at the very beginning, and the goal is to train myself to get a solid foundation of the language. Now, when you have learned and you have a solid foundation of the language, it becomes a little bit more automatic. And when you start doing that, you don't even think about it, you just use it. And in this phase, I create and choose, as I said before, monolingual and bilingual text. I create them through the internet. I still use bilingual translation, but I also read a lot more. And the principles are not only quality, but also quantity. And the goal is to build a language core in your head. Now, when you have reached a certain level, the language becomes very familiar. And this means that you can actually do all sorts of things and not even think about it. Time is not a problem anymore. In this phase, what I use, for example, is TV, movies, and obviously native speakers, because human interaction is important. So the method basically in this phase is that I create my own environment where I can use the language every single time in all possible situations. And that means that I use the language constantly. My goal, which is an ambitious goal obviously, is to reach a native-like fluency. But obviously we never stop learning. We always learn. Well, the reason why it is effective, and I found out about it later, is that it respects the Pareto principle. It means that you learn something a little bit and you learn it well, and that helps you to learn the other part of the language, which is actually 80% of the rest. That's the reason why it's called the 20-80 principle. Learning a language is not a linear process. For example, you don't first learn all the colors and then you learn all the other parts, etc. It's something that comes randomly at you. It's not linear, but it's progressive. It means that you keep progressing. And a good thing is that my method changes with time. I don't always do the same things in the different phases. And it's consistent. That means that I use it in a certain way and it has to respect the principles of consistency. And it adapts to my way of learning, my tastes. It's constant because I do it every single day once I start learning a language. And it's varied because I do all sorts of things with a language, not just one. And it's obviously fun. It's entertaining. I find it very entertaining. So the conclusion is that language learning is not difficult and it can be fun. And another thing that you always have to keep in mind is that it can change your life. And it can be done if you know how to do it. And another very good news is that internet is a revolution and it has changed the way we can learn. So the last thing that I wanted to tell you is happy language learning.